Hurst-Harosh is an associate professor in the Humanities Education Development Unit at the University of Cape Town. Her research focuses on African youth language practices, including stylects and registers, as well as translanguaging pedagogies and the use of African languages in higher education. Recent publications include the monograph Tsotsitaal in South Africa, Style and Metaphor in Youth Language Practices, and the edited collection Youth Language Practices in Urban Language Context in Africa, together with Rajend Mestri and Heather Brooks. Thank you so much for being with us, Dr. Hurst. We look forward to your presentation. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much, and yeah, I'd just like to say thanks so much to you all for inviting me to talk in such esteemed company. I've seen quite a few of the talks on YouTube, of course, although it's always not in a good time for us in South Africa. But yeah, thanks very much for inviting me to participate in this forum. Yeah, so I was invited to speak here about my youth language research, which I've been involved in for about 15 years. And this paper basically is going to outline the field of research, which has emerged in recent years across the African continent. So the research focuses on the language practices of African youth, using descriptors such as registers, stylects, urban vernaculars, and I'm going to interrogate those a little bit later. So first in the paper, I'm going to discuss the term, hold on, let me just get my slides moving. I'm going to discuss the term youth language and kind of problematize that a little bit. And then secondly, I'm going to introduce some of the larger projects which have been undertaken across the continent, including methodological issues, and then what I see as the big contributions from the field. And then lastly, I'm going to consider whether the conceptual framework of decolonial thinking is a useful way to understand these practices. But before I start, I wanted to address just one major issue. Why am I talking about African youth languages when I'm not African and I'm not a youth? I'm a white middle-aged woman from the UK. So just to explain how I got into the field, I did an MA at Nottingham Trent University on globalization. And during that, I became interested in the role of English in Africa during the colonial period and afterwards. And that led me to investigate the ways that English is resisted and counter narratives about colonial languages. And through this, I was drawn into the worlds of initially Fanakalo and Tsotsitaal in Southern Africa. And then I moved to Cape Town to do my PhD. So that's how I became involved in the field. So Fanakalo, which I originally looked at, is a kind of mining language. It was developed in the mines, and I saw it as kind of top down. That's what I did my MA dissertation on, a comparison of Fanakalo and Tsotsitaal. And I was looking at Tsotsitaal because it seemed to counter that as this sort of bottom-up language created by youth in Sophiatown, one of the mixed townships during apartheid. That was eventually it was knocked down by the apartheid authorities, and people were subjected to forced removals. But the more I dug around Tsotsitaal, the more I researched around it, the less the story around Tsotsitaal became less clear. So much of the discourse around Tsotsitaal was sort of socio-political, people reminiscing about this this golden era for culture and social life in Sophiatown, when Tsotsitaal was this language which co-opted the language of the oppressor, Afrikaans, and it became part of an identity of resistance. So at that stage, Tsotsitaal was sort of grammatically based on Afrikaans. And the identity of resistance was sort of notable in this figure of the Tsotsi, a gangster who resisted white domination. And this image here is a kind of representation of that kind of character of the Tsotsi. So Tsotsi means sort of criminal or a gang member, and then Taal is Afrikaans for language, so it's Tsotsitaal. But then other interviewees in Cape Town, in the Cape Town townships where I was doing my research, they were Xhosa speakers, isiXhosa speakers. They told me that they spoke Tsotsitaal still, but they did it in Xhosa. And then other people indicated that certain people in the township spoke it, like the male youth particularly, and that it was still a vibrant language. People talked about it as a mixed language. And they said it was a secret language that only the in-crowd would know. But then other people said everyone in the townships used Tzotzil, like a little bit here and there, and that even old ladies could understand it. So, you know, there was quite a lot of confusion around how to define this, this sort of phenomenon. So I started to try to record examples of Tzotzil to figure out what it was. But then the harder we looked at the linguistic features, the less there was, the fuzzier it became. So there were a few lexical items that kept coming up, a few pieces of vocabulary that kept coming up. But there seemed to be very little more than that. The syntax itself, the grammatical framework was Isiprosa, pretty standard, and that was a regional African language. So, you know, we were looking and we couldn't see much. So it started to seem that other aspects were, other than the linguistic aspects, were more important. So when people were asked in interviews to speak Tzotzil, they switched into a different kind of performance or style, using lots of gestures, speaking more assertively, using a different tone. So we started to focus more on those aspects of the performances and on the identity that accompanied the style, the linguistic style. And then at the same time, reports also started surfacing as I went through my research about youth languages elsewhere in Africa with similar personalities, if I can put it like that. So I first connected with a bunch of people in Netherlands and Germany who were interested in these phenomena across the continent. And some of them were from Africa, or they were connected with researchers from Africa. And they were interested, and they had some money and wanted to put some time and money into researching these varieties. So I'm thinking of people like Martin Maus and Storch, and then Frida Erastus from Kenyatta, Nico Nassenstein and Andrea Hollington were all working in that kind of area. And they were looking at youth languages like Sheng in Kenya and Kamfranglais in Cameroon, Nushi in Côte d'Ivoire. And then there were newly described ones that some of our African colleagues started to investigate. So Luyaye in Uganda and Sintonto in Zimbabwe, and lots of new ones. And so it turned out these youth languages were sort of present in more or less all the big African cities. So since then, since that kind of period, I've been trying to facilitate a network and enable African scholars to investigate those contexts. And so I did a bit of fundraising and so on. We've had a few conferences, workshops, panels at larger conferences, which are focused on this work. And I'll talk a bit about some of those. So in some ways, this work from Africa has begun to lead the way, I think, in studies of registers or stylects, or whatever you want to, however you describe them. And I'm going to come back to some of the sort of big outputs later. But first, I just want to talk about the objective analysis here, so-called youth language, and problematize this term. So what is youth language? When we talk about youth language, what do we mean firstly by youth? So the category of youth is generally understood as a stage in life that occupies a transitional space between childhood and adulthood. And according to Mary Buchholz, in much youth research, the youth category lacks clear definition, and it might depend on social circumstances rather than chronological age or cultural position. And it can range from pre-adolescents to people in their 40s. And so in many African societies, social practice such as initiation and coming of age ceremonies have been celebrated as rites of passage into this youth phase. And then other events such as marriage and starting a family mark the end of the youth phase. But because of limited economic opportunities, young people are often compelled to assume adult life as late entrants. So this youth phase can actually extend quite a long way. So a very broad age range has been described in research from the continent. And then other studies, including work that I've done, have included older speakers. So while youth learn youth language practices while they're young, older speakers might still use parts of these practices in older peer groups when they get back together with their youthful friends. And so Buchholz also says that youth as a cultural stage often marks the beginning of a long-term, even lifelong engagement in particular cultural practices, whether it's practitioners continue to be included in the youth category or not. But some practices undoubtedly emerge from or during the youth phase. And that phase is marked by extensive peer interaction. So I find the descriptive term youth language remains a useful one to refer to the creative and playful practices generated among young peers. But it doesn't necessarily mean that only a specific age range is included in the data sets. And then on the other hand, using the term language is also problematic here, because African youth, first of all, they don't always exclusively use youth language, but they also use the urban vernacular, their home language or home languages, if that's different from the urban vernacular, one or more languages of education. And then secondly, and perhaps more importantly, the linguistic practices of youth that much of this field was focused on are not full or autonomous languages open to all genders, but they're primarily male stylizations and or performances involving discursive identity constructions within certain contexts and in response to other participants. So youth languages such as Tsotsitaal, Sheng and Nushi are therefore not languages per se that can be systematically identified and codified based on grammar or even a lexicon, although lexis can be emblematic or indexical. But anyway, despite these terminological problems, I still tend to use the well-known term youth language to talk about these phenomena, although we're open to newer terminologies like youth speak, which might avoid the ambiguities of the label language. So youth language was often historically represented through vocabulary lists or lists of slang terms. And certainly relexification, the use of new words in place of old words, is one of the strategies used by youth in marking out their language practices. But it's not the only strategy or feature. So youth language involves situated and contextual language practices that employ a variety of strategies, especially lexical, gestural, and discursive, to differentiate youth speech from other types of speech in the community. But youth language should not be viewed as a separate language or linguistic system, but as a register, discursive performance, or stylect. And that's the term that I've been working with, that I proposed in my dissertation. So that refers to a performed discursive practice, which includes the extra and paralinguistic aspects. And so Stylect, I originally proposed in 2008, and we've subsequently developed it in other publications. The concept's based on the work of people like Nick Coupland, Ben Rampton, and alongside key style theorists like Jacobson and Bell. And it takes its foundation a concept of style as the range of variation in the speech of an individual. A stylect involves the styling of resources, including these extra and paralinguistic resources, in a performance to achieve indexical social meaning. As such, it can refer to practices ranging from light to deep in a stylistic range of an individual. And the use of resources linked to the stylect can index a particular identity. So in the case of Tsotsitaal, they index sort of the Tsotsi, or alternatively, the streetwise kind of identity is called a clever in the South African context. So this term has been picked up by a number of other youth language researchers as a useful way to differentiate youth performative practices from other types of language practices in those contexts. So the other types of language practices in the context, we've been differentiating, particularly in my recent work with Raj and Heather, we've been differentiating between urban contact vernaculars or urban vernaculars and youth manipulations or youth languages. So we used to refer to these dialects as African urban youth languages, but we dropped the urban for a couple of reasons. So firstly, it's this crossover with urban vernaculars. And there other language practices common to these contexts include code switching. These are very multilingual contexts where these African youth languages are present. And then, there are these big urban varieties or urban vernaculars. So the urban vernacular here refers to the urban form of an African language in those cases, For example, urban isiXhosa or urban isiZulu, or in some cases it might refer to a code mixture such as isiZulu Sesotho mixture, which is often used in a lot of parts of Soweto. The urban varieties of African languages in South Africa's urban centres are differentiated from the standard forms of these African languages by factors such as increased switching and borrowing, contractions, clipping, and so on. So for example, urban isiXhosa is marked by a heavy influence from English, including borrowings, particularly in regard to logical connectors. So Makoni et al. From 2007 describe urban languages in Africa as new linguistic configurations based on indigenous languages that are adaptive responses by speakers to the changing environment of the African urban space and the new communicative needs that it presents. And they state that urban vernaculars are languages made up of discourse elements, lexical items, and syntactic forms drawn from another number of different languages. And they clearly differentiate vernaculars from use registers in their data, highlighting vernacular's widespread use and social importance and focusing on their use by adults in everyday situations. They suggest that the use of these vernaculars allows urban residents to move out of old ethnicities and create new identities based on the urban experience, meaning that urban vernaculars mark sort of a multi-ethnic urbanity, which is similar to use stylects, but to differentiate between these urban vernaculars and stylized youth registers, while urban vernaculars are outcomes of contact often, youth language makes use of specific manipulation strategies such as metaphor, form manipulation, semantic manipulations, circumlocutions, archaisms, idiophones. This was described by Keesing and Moose in their seminal article from 2004. And none of those sort of manipulations are particularly characteristic of urban vernaculars. But urban vernaculars and youth languages are often conflated in the literature, because syntactically they're the same. Youth varieties or youth languages, they use the urban vernaculars as their grammatical base. But lexically, youth differentiate their language to mark peer group belonging. And then the second thing about it is this idea of urban versus rural. So this dichotomy between urban and rural. So in some other work that I've been doing with Frida from Frida Kanana from Kenyatta, we talked about there's no simple binary between rural and urban youth language resources or practices. And what we're witnessing is rural forms being used in urban contexts and urban forms used in rural contexts. So there's no clear binary. Youth draw on resources from across this sort of linguistic picture. And both modern and so-called traditional resources are drawn on in metaphors and meaning making of youth. As I mentioned, archaisms are often drawn on for lexical items in urban slang contexts. And both European and indigenous languages contribute the source material. So forms that might be considered old and archaic or traditional, they don't necessarily go away. They find their way into these youth languages through sort of sometimes semantic shift and so on. And forms resurface with a metaphorical meaning. So I described some metaphors which drew clearly on sort of traditional practices. So through looking at these crossovers, youth language can provide a window on African modernities. I just want to very quickly go through the development of the field in terms of some of the conferences and publications that have come out, and I'm going to skip through these slides quite quickly. But there are a substantial number of scholars working in this field now who are based in African academic institutions. And there are a lot of collaborations between, as I mentioned, African-based researchers and researchers in the global north. So one of the earliest ones that I was involved in was, there were two Africanist tags in 2010 and 2012, and there was a big sort of youth language and urban language workshop at the one in 2012. we had a special issue out on Tsotsitaal studies in 2014, which emerged out of a project funded by SANPAD. It was the previous Netherlands development program. And then I was funded after that by the NRF in South Africa and by my university to run a comparative project with partners across Africa. And then we hosted the first African Youth Language Conference in Cape Town in 2013, and then the second one in 2015 in Kenya at Kenyatta University. And then the earlier panel led to a publication by Nico Nassenstein and Andrea Hollington. That was the first sort of edited collection on African youth languages in 2015. Ayo Mensah from Nigeria ran a double special edition in sociolinguistic studies in 2016. And then publications began to emerge from the collaborative, sort of comparative and collaborative work across the continent. So myself and Augustine Ebonge edited a collection in 2017, I think that was. And then myself and Frida, out of one of the African language conferences, published a book about new media, social media, and so on, and African youth languages in 2018. Chege Githiora from Kenya had his monograph on shame published in 2018. And there's an open source journal now, which was started by some of our German colleagues in the network, and that often focuses on youth language issues, African youth language issues in particular. And they had a special issue on critical youth language studies. Taiwo Olarentoa Oju looked at rural-urban divide. That was also 2019, and another book collaboration, which was in French and English. And then I myself had my monograph out. It took ages, but it came out in 2020 finally. We've got a recent Linguistics Vanguard special issue, and then the book that myself, Raj, and Heather Brooks had out last year. And then there's a new forthcoming book, which is a global perspectives one, which comes out of the International Conference on Youth Languages, which happens every, I think it's 2 or 3 years, which has also been quite productive in terms of African youth language research. So you can see the field has become kind of increasingly productive, and there's been a lot of young academics from Africa publishing through these routes, which has been really encouraging. And the development of the field is kind of reflected by these publications. So alongside the growth of the field, there's been an increasing focus on methodological considerations as well, with an emphasis on naturalistic data. And when we talk about naturalistic data, it's often merely just intended to refer to data that was collected through observation or recording of speech in natural settings or contexts, as opposed to elicited data or experimental data in labs. But we've been advocating particularly for video data, because it can capture that performance, the particular marked performance that typifies these stylects, including the extra and paralinguistic features. So authentic language data in the context of youth language is that which best captures the indexical performance of a particular street or peer group identity situated within a specific context. And video data means you can analyze both the video and audio data simultaneously, such as through using Elan software, and you can annotate the para and extra linguistic features alongside the language. And you can also annotate other things like discourses or material artifacts, or the possibilities for analysis are quite broad when you've got video data. So many youth language researchers, including myself, we try and use research assistants from the community of practice to capture the data, or otherwise the researchers themselves are from the community of practice, because obviously authentic youth language data is produced by useful speakers for other useful speakers, and it's not going to be produced by useful speakers for researchers who are eliciting data. It's sort of a performance that happens in a particular context. And so the data, even when it's researchers from the community, the data is obviously still subject to the observer's paradox. But there's been a lot of highlighting of these kinds of methodological issues and looking at, the best ways to capture youth language data. In terms of contributions from the field, so all the scholars I've been describing have been taking the speech of youth seriously, saying that youth do have different practices, but obviously trying to understand these practices beyond slang descriptions. And the work was influenced by third wave variation studies, so the work of Eckert and Buchholz and everybody who forefronted youth practices and style. But the African context, we think, is different, and we believe it has something important to contribute to current sociolinguistics. And this is partly because of the very large youth population in Africa and the resulting importance of youth language, particularly in urban sectors. These urban centres have been described as melting pots of linguistic contact and change. And we're witnessing rapid language change over a short period of time in the urban centres. So descriptions of these contexts and the ways that youth move between various linguistic resources can provide insights as well into longer term change. The contexts are also, of course, partly outcomes of colonialism and colonial language policies, which leads to particular linguistic attitudes and orientations, power dynamics, and linguistic outcomes that result from the dynamics between colonial languages and African languages. And then as well, the inherent multilingualism of African urban contexts is noteworthy. So as mentioned, there are widespread practices of code switching, mixed urban vernaculars, high levels of multilingualism. So in South Africa, for example, someone might speak 3 or more African languages. So some of my research assistants have spoken up to 9 African languages, as well as English and Afrikaans. And they switch between these languages in everyday conversation. So I think this contrasts quite strongly with more bilingual or monolingual contexts, such as Europe, where youth languages may more typically emerge from or draw on migrant language resources, rather than this sort of wealth of indigenous resources. So recent theory has shown the ways that language practice involves the use of various linguistic resources that speakers have at their disposal. And youth and urban vernaculars are particularly in flux and can be seen as breaking out of the boundaries of colonial naming and categorization. And the concept of standard language itself in Africa has been problematized by authors such as Simply Makoni and Alistair Pennycook, who highlighted the colonial history of linguistic categorization and argued for an embrace of urban vernaculars in response to the Christian colonial project of language invention. In their work, the standard form is never was the basis of language practice in African contexts. They argue that a process of disinventing and reconstituting languages is a necessary process, and they contend that the current shift in urban contexts towards mixed vernaculars reflects a creative adaptation to new contexts. They support the widespread use of urban speech forms, which are ontologically inconsistent with notions of language as phonetically sealed units. And the widespread nature of urban speech forms, including youth language styles, or Stylects, reflects new and emerging language practices, and youth language should be seen as complementary rather than oppositional practices, as it has sometimes been framed, to be in competition with the standard forms. So I've argued elsewhere that new and positive terms and ways to explain Tsotsitaals and urban youth language in general are really now required. So the last thing I want to talk about is this idea of African youth languages as decolonial practice. So during and following the Rhodes Must Fall movement in South Africa, we all became familiar with the work of decolonial theorists. And I began to wonder whether that conceptual framework was a useful way to understand youth language practices. And I'd like to make the case now that African youth language practices and youth language in general challenge forms of dominant power and oppression, and for this reason might be considered as decolonial practice. So a quick definition there that we're probably, a lot of us are already familiar with. Decoloniality as long-standing patterns of power that emerged as a result of colonialism. And coloniality survives colonialism. It's maintained in books, in the criteria of academic performance, in cultural patterns, and so on. In a way, as modern subjects, we breathe coloniality all the time and every day. So decolonial thought or decolonial approaches work at the level of political society, and decolonial theory is it's an activist agenda, and it's undisciplined, meaning that it's non-conformist. Decolonial thinking takes place in the border, and the border is defined by both epistemic distance and geographical distance. So I propose that users of Tsotsitaal and other African youth language are using undisciplined or non-conformist language as an act of subversion in order to challenge dominant power. This practice isn't restricted to Africa. Indeed, youth language is a feature of all societies, but the explicit position of 8 of African youth languages, decolonial, is a result of both colonial oppression and the domination of Western modernity, and the resulting border location of African youth, indicated by both epistemic difference and geographical difference. So as a result of this border location, many township youth are politicized, inherently decolonial thinkers, and this position emerges in their language practices. So I'm just going to give a little bit of examples from the data. So the first set of data here shows a number of examples of lexical items from Tsotsitaal or from Tsotsitaal practices, and particularly metaphors that are related to a decolonial position. So metaphor is used in Tsotsitaal to create non-standard meaning, and as such it can be considered as rebellious. It's being used for in-group communication, it's non-conformist. And these kinds of slang lexical items are often considered disrespectful by older generation and parents because they don't understand the language, or they feel hoodwinked by the metaphors and assume that speakers are trying to hide something from them. In some of the above examples, lexical items are taken from the language of the oppressor. So there you've got blind and kwai and fagaza. So they're taken, the first one is taken from English blind, and it's used with the opposite meaning. So their meanings are subverted. So a word will be taken from English or Afrikaans, and then the meaning subverted. And kwai, something that's good, awesome, or nice, comes from the Afrikaans word, which means bad or ill-tempered. And then other examples there are indexical of an anti-establishment position, particularly with reference to the apartheid struggle. This is done in 2 ways. Firstly, through Tsotsitaal coinages relating to aspects of resistance. So there you've got a Baas cap, white supremacy or white domination. So Baas deriving from English boss, and it's a reference to a white employer or a white male person. And then Moldaat is derived from the Afrikaans word soldaat, which refers to a soldier, a term used primarily to refer to those cadres in the liberation movement who'd undergone military training. And then finally, there are a number of words that take aspects and effects of apartheid policy and the racist positions of white people in the state and make puns of them in Tsotsitaal. So you've got what we've got there, the loafer's scarp, and the position of being unemployed comes from loafer, meaning someone who's work shy or idle. So the term was used in the context of apartheid labor legislation, but today the term has positive connotations and indicates a streetwise guy. And then next, thinking about grammatical rebelliousness in this youth language kind of forms. So non-conformist aspects of Tsotsitaal can be seen at the grammatical level, and they've been described in a number of publications. So grammatically rebellious features include attitude markers, elisions or omissions, and syllable reversals. So an author, Gunning, investigated grammatical differences between Tsotsitaal speech and the vernacular in Soweto, and identified noun class shift as one way in which Tsotsitaal can be grammatically rebellious. And she described a shift from class 1, which is the human noun class, to class 9, that shift conveys a sense of disrespect, but it can actually also be eulogizing if you're talking to your friend. Brooks described another form of grammatical rebelliousness in the dropping of morphological items that are obvious for someone who operates within the community of practice, but not necessarily obvious for someone who's not a member of the in-group. And then she also describes the use of elision for aesthetic effects such as rhythmic flow, and to keep speech from appearing too obvious and not streetwise, and also to deliberately kind of hide the message. And then Poulet Welsh highlights another aspect of rebellious grammar in the formation of ludlings. So ludlings are secret or in-group languages that are formed through specific manipulation patterns, for example, syllable reversal. So he says that ludlings contribute to the lexicon of Tsotsitaal, and that can explain some of the neologisms and words of no known origin in Tsotsitaal. And there are also examples where Tsotsitaal words themselves are subjected to syllable reversal. So such as in Solista from Meadowlands, where the Tsotsitaal word via, which means to go, is reversed to become yava. So these kinds of practices, such as syllable reversal, are used all over the world, for example, in the French language practice, Roland. And then this kind of grammatical rebelliousness can be interpreted as a decolonial move, in the sense that speakers are rejecting standard language and are instead stylistically reframing language within their community of practice through lexicalization and metaphor, in order to exclude an out-group and signal an in-group streetwise and non-conformist identity. And then finally, the emergence of these sort of youth languages in Africa often reflect a decolonial ideology. So Clive Glaser traced the history of youth gangs in Soweto, including their alignment with resistance politics beginning in the late 1950s. And he says that they were influenced by everyday experiences of poverty, discrimination, block social mobility, and police harassment. Tutsis developed an antipathy to the establishment and to institutions of authority. And then as apartheid progressed, the Tutsi gangs were increasingly mobilized by political organizations, to the point that in 1960, in the wake of the Sharpeville massacre, the criminal and the political became intertwined, and politicized Tutsis became known as Com-Tutsis or Comrade Tutsis in the struggle to end apartheid. So as a result, publications which draw on the history of Tsotsitaal have often correlated it with an explicitly decolonial or resistance position. For example, Molemy, who wrote the first dictionary on Tsotsitaal, said that it was sometimes understood as a parlance of secrecy in a bid to stay one step ahead of white state authorities during the apartheid era. And another author, Magogodi, says Tsotsitaal is in its original form a lingua of rebellion. It uses some of the former oppressors' languages and then corrupts them deliberately to create a lingo that's only understood by street merchants, street guys. And there's a bigger mission around Tsotsigkeit, like Tsotsiness, which is about using the culture of deceit to deceive the oppressor. And he says, in any revolution, the oppressor and colonizer must be deceived. So again, this sort of idea of the ideology behind the use of Tsotsitaal being linked to anti-colonial, anti-apartheid positions. So rather than thinking of youth language practices as arising from sort of urban crime, which is how they're often described, we can imagine them as arising from conditions of inequality in colonial and later post-colonial societies, in imposed nation states where the dominance of European languages and capitalist consumerism further disadvantages those outside the Western episteme. And as such, these grassroots language practices amongst youth can be seen as a decolonial practice, a challenge to coloniality. And other language practices could be considered in this way, like African-American hip-hop languages and the language of minority migrant groups in European contexts. And that kind of reconceptualization might provide us with a way to understand how and why youth language practices emerge, and why Africa has become such an interesting site of focus for youth language researchers. So this is my last slide. I can see I'm almost in time. In terms of some conclusions, just thinking about how to represent youth language. And, you know, it's critical in this whole discussion to think about how African youth are represented in this kind of research. So they shouldn't be othered or exoticized, the journal The Mouth made that argument in their critical youth languages issue. But nevertheless, youth language practices are noteworthy. There are these different practices and we should take this feature of use seriously. So how do we fairly represent that? And I think emphasizing fair and representative methods and ethics in gathering this kind of data, framing youth language as decolonial rather than delinquent or deviant, challenging discourses about youth and crime, which often emerge in popular media and so on, interrogating discourses about broken English or broken isiZulu and so on, and then trying to understand youth practices beyond slang as a sort of more holistic discursive identity performance. So that's all from me, and I didn't prepare a reference list, I'm afraid, but I can provide one if people would like to see that. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hurst. We really appreciate it. It was super interesting. I will now give over to Prof. Makoni for open up the conversation.
Okay. Before I pose a couple of questions, I just wanted to make a number of announcements. We managed to enter into an agreement with Multilingual Matters, who will be publishing most of the material from the Global Forum. In our last meeting with individuals who are organizing this forum, we managed to determine that we've got material for at least 13 different volumes. And the first volume, which will be published in, I think, May, June, will have the session by Chris Hatton, Kwesipra, John Bowie, Bonnie McQueenie, and Robbie Shilliam. With an epilogue by Basi Antia and a preface by Alistair Pennico. Volume 2 will be made up of contributions by Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Walter Minolo, Catherine Walsh, Jean Komarov, Bonaventura dos Santos, Suleiman D. Bahir, and Drusilla Cornell. The epilogue will be written by the Brazilian scholar Clarissa Jordao. We're still negotiating with a colleague to write the foreword for that, the preface for that volume. We expect that volume to be out, I think, sometime in July, August, and then we will continue as we go along. We have been fortunate to get funding from Oslo University, and at the same time, Penn State has agreed to fund the project and fund a number of our graduate students who are going to be assigned to the project, including Vishna and Kim. So those are the sort of quasi-administrative aspects of the project where are we at the moment. And we've got sessions lined up every Friday until the end of the calendar year. And we've begun now preparing schedules for sessions for 2023, which will begin with a series of presentations by scholars from Eastern Europe on decoloniality in contexts in which there was no colonial history. Those will be the first series of sessions that we will have. Now, let me get back to more interesting things. Elaine, I want to read to you a statement from the abstract by Susan Cook, and it's in a chapter of a book called Urban Language in a Rural Setting, the case of King in South Africa. And she writes, this piece argues that urban can be an aspect of someone's identity as well as geographical location. What's your take on that? She's arguing that urban is not so much a geographical setting, but it's a style, a way of projecting yourself. So you can have an urban style even in a rural setting.
Yeah, that's nice. Yeah, I mean, I think what certainly the work I've done with Frida, and there are some other authors, Eric Kioko, also from Kenya, who've looked at the ways that Sheng is being used in, peri-urban settings, as well as peri-urban and then peri-rural. There's a continuum. It's not as easy as just rural and urban, I think. And certainly people in those peri-urban contexts draw on the same forms, and they innovate their own forms of Sheng. And then there was, I think in Eric Kyoko's work, he looked at a form of Sheng that was based on the local African language, which I forget what it was, but certainly they're sort of performing this sort of urban identity, and I think that's the thing. It's an indexical performance. It's these meta-pragmatic stereotypes are being drawn on, like in South Africa, the clever is sort of the streetwise guy who lives in the urban setting, and it's a meta-pragmatic stereotype that the use of these particular resources is indexing. So I mean, I think it can take place anywhere, definitely.
Yeah.
And I think you're right. It's part of somebody's identity, or certainly the identity that they're drawing on or referencing.
Yeah, it makes sense to think about it as part of one's identity, particularly if you imagine a context in which there's a lot of secular migration. You move from some rural town into your urban setting and back again into the rural place. So in a sense, it's part of your repertoire of identities that you act on. But that's not my main concern about this particular area of study. What worries me is the disconnect between the way the research into youth language constructs ideas about society and what I think societies look like. Most societies are made up of intergenerational connections. So you talk to your grandmother, you talk to your grandfather, you talk to your uncle, you talk to your young brother, you talk to your siblings. So there's this intergenerational connection, but it appears that the impulse in youth language is more or less towards isolating and creating a particular generation, as if that generation doesn't talk to anybody else except itself. And I'm not sure. The point I'm trying to make is sociologically, the idea of urban youth variety is not sociologically tenable, because there is no group in society that just talks to itself.
I mean, a few things came to mind there. In terms of the intergenerational stuff and the rural urban stuff as well. So yeah, you get like young guys who go to the city and work, and then they'll go back and their young cousin will learn the youth language off them. So I've interviewed people who said no, they learned Tsotsitaal back in rural areas because people used to come home with it, at sort of celebration times and so on. But I mean, in terms of generational, again, you interview people and they're sort of like, yeah, those old guys, they don't know how to speak Tsotsitaal, But then the old guys are like, these youth, they don't speak the real Tsotsitaal, they speak something else, you know, it's all full of English. So there's that sort of tension between the two. But then you also interview youngsters who are like, you know, the old guys know how to do it properly as well, you know. So there's also respect, and I think it's again, it's about that sort of streetwiseness and identity, and yeah, whether if somebody's authentically sort of indexing that identity, whatever age they are, you know, people do continue to use these forms with their friends as they get older, as I said. So, but I know what you mean. It's you know, so I guess it's the old argument between youth and adults, isn't it?
So is it possible, for example, that you would get more intellectual mileage if you framed research into urban youth varieties as a subset of research into language ideologies? Is this not something about language ideologies? Right. That when they say, oh, this is not authentic, this is less authentic, this is more authentic, and all that, that in actual fact, what you are studying a manifestation of language ideologies in a way. I don't know what Judith would say, I mean, what Judith would say, but that's the impression that I get from reading your work, that this is research into language ideologies without saying so.
Well, I think, I mean, people have looked at the ideologies surrounding it, and some, I'm thinking of Thabo Tsele, I think, did some work on language attitudes, and I can't remember if we looked at ideology specifically. And I did sort of talk about that a bit in my monograph. But I mean, it's a range of things that we're looking at. I don't think it's only ideologies, you know. But I mean, it's a nice way to frame that. The tension there, definitely.
Then I've got two last questions, then I'll hand over to somebody. In your studies into urban youth varieties, do you only use spoken, or is there no written data that you guys use?
We've so me and Frida looked at social media. So we were looking at, and then we also looked at sort of print media. Raj Mestri did one article on how Tsotsitaal was represented in some newspaper columns. But obviously, I think there it's sort of mediated, and you know, and it's a, you know, social media is a different practice. It draws on different kinds of resources, so you know, emoticons and so on. So but it's a very productive area, and I'm doing some more work with Nico Nassenstein on that as well. There's a lot of, obviously as well with the pandemic, we haven't been able to do much face-to-face data collection. So I think there's quite a lot coming out around social media practices amongst youth now.
Then the last comment, which I think is linked to my other previous comments, is that it would be very interesting to see what gerontological perspectives what insights they can give you on youth language. Because in gerontology, for example, aging is not defined chronologically only. Neither is it defined in terms of activities only. And they have things like functional aging, they have things like the activities that you get engaged in. And they also have arguments that say you are able to retain certain styles of talking even as you go towards the latter phase of your own life. So in a way, an enlightening way of looking at what you are doing in terms of youth varieties is not to look at the youth anymore, but to look at different communities and to see what is it that we may learn about the youth if we're focusing on children, or we're focusing, let's say, on the elderly communities towards the end of the life course. Don't take me seriously, but once in a while it makes sense not to look at your context, but to avoid it and see what do I learn if I look into other research areas. For example, what can I learn about youth varieties from studying from reading about the sociolinguistics of language use amongst the elderly and aging communities?
I mean, it'd be useful to move away from this idea of youth as an age-defined category. You know, youth is actually a practice or youthful practice. Don't have to be kind of age-defined. So that's a very useful way of doing it.
And that's what the people in gerontology have managed to. That's the argument that they make quite effectively. That chronological aging doesn't take you very far. Activities the individual is engaged in may take you far. So in a way, one way of handling the issue about youth is to then ask, how is the notion of aging handled or understood in gerontology, for example? Then you see what arguments you can be able to draw, what insights you can draw from gerontology, and then you bring them to bear onto your studies in youth varieties.
Perhaps you can point me at one or two good studies.
Okay. Yes, I wish I had done them, but thanks a lot. Thanks. Let me give over to Chanel.
Okay, great. Prof. Judith Irvine, you can go ahead.
Thank you. And thank you so much, Ellen, for this presentation, which was so informative and interesting. And I wish I had really read all the things, all the works that you had mentioned, especially your own, of course, but all of them. And I will do that. I can get the references. Thank you. But I do also have a question, especially it relates to Sinfree's comments, especially since he invoked me while making them. But it's a methodological question. When you were outlining the methods that you and your colleagues have relied upon, they were all about recording speech practices and gesture and so on video in situ. And I certainly take the point as very important that one wants to resist the kind of research that is based primarily or even exclusively on interviewing, and that mistakes focus groups for social interaction. So it's really important what you're doing. What I wonder though about is that when you look at that, are you primarily looking for distributional patterns, which is of course something that one can get out of looking at that, such data? How are you getting at the metapragmatic and metalinguistic dimensions of the material, which are so important in terms of what you think is going on? Do you have any systematic way that you're doing that? Or how are you thinking about the investigation into those matters?
Yeah, thank you for the question. There's the new book with Raj and Heather. We've got a chapter in there talking a lot more about the methodological kind of side of this. And obviously, you know, we're saying that the video capture is important, but there are other things to capture too. So obviously all kinds of lenses on the phenomenon are useful. So not to kind of cast out interview data, obviously, because that does provide, so my monograph took interview data and sort of video data and pulled those different perspectives together. In terms of, so there's been more case study kind of work. So I'm thinking about Heather Brooks's work in Johannesburg, and she did, I think it was based on ethnography and communication work. It was linguistic ethnography, and she worked on, it was a longitudinal study. She worked for quite a few years with this particular group and looked at the social sort of relations between the members, and then you know, who had more status, and so it was like it was much more a qualitative kind of look at one particular group and their practices. So I mean, there's so much room for more work to be done. There's been very few quantitative studies. There's you know, I think because these practices are so specific to particular peer groups, you could look at one peer group's practice for decades, you know, which is what I'm doing, and you still discover kinds of new things about the data. So I'm moving much more into kind of pragmatics analysis now, to try and get at some of those things like the discourses, the conversation, even conversation analysis, and so on. And I'm really interested in looking at how artifacts are being used in sort of interactions as well. So yeah, there's a lot that can still be done with this kind of research, and I think we're still just learning about the scope of the work. And yeah, many people are coming from many different perspectives, I think.
Mm-hmm.
That answered your question. I got a bit sidetracked.
Thank you so much. Okay, we will now move on to Joseph Schmidt. You have the floor.
Hello, really an excellent presentation, Ellen. I was fascinated. I've been interested in languages in Africa for 40 years now, so I'm particularly interested in our more recent methodologies. So the first question is, which social media data collection tool would you recommend at the moment? We've got two for Twitter, but not really happy. And the second related question is, could you show us as a model one of your ELAN annotations, because people who want to follow you might underestimate the complexity, because you know, you really need a lot of research assistance, I think, and you mentioned that. So these two methodological questions would be very important if we want to have, you know, more people following your example here in this audience and beyond.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I don't, in terms of a data collection tool for social media, I don't know. Which ones do you use?
Well, we have one that we changed ourselves, which was basically developed in Potsdam in Germany. And yeah, of course, you know, it is related to these API collection points, and you're never quite sure, you know, which percentage or which selection of the data you get. But you do get something, not enough for many quantitative analysis, I would say. I mean, it depends on your bounding box. I mean, you in South Africa, you could take a half of the Western Cape or so, but even then you get, or you need a lot of collection time.
Yeah, I mean, I've worked on, we just went in and sort of manually looked at, you know, Facebook sites where Tsotsitaal is being shared and discussed. And I worked with Roland Kwasi from Côte d'Ivoire, who looked at Nushi, and he did something similar. So then we kind of, you know, it was very manual. We didn't use a tool. We went in and sort of looked at the ways that these practices were being discussed in those kinds of group spaces. So it was more about metalinguistic discussion.
I fully understand, of course, I see the problem. And I mean, is there anything simpler than ELAN, or is that really the only thing you can recommend? I mean, it is a standard, I understand, but it is too much work.
I know what you mean. One minute of video data takes hours to transcribe, but I mean, that's the one that I've used. I don't know if there's anything simpler, and I do find it really kind of an excellent tool if you want to get down to that really fine-grained level. Yeah, and I mean, I've annotated, yeah, the sort of discourses, and then you can add so many different layers of analysis that it gets really, really interesting. But yeah, I mean, I know it's not the easiest tool to use either. I don't know if anybody else has any ideas.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Sangeeta?
Thank you for your very interesting presentation, and I've learned a lot as well through that, but also the discussion so far. I have a couple of questions, and I'll also comment on the ELAN discussion that just took place. And I'll start off with what you ended with, Ellen, and that is how to represent language or youth language in your case. And you had a couple of pointers. And I'm wondering that if coloniality does indeed survive colonialism, which I think it does, how are we reproducing ourselves as researchers coloniality? And I'm specifically interested in your comments on the naming practices as far as how we frame what we call language. So the discussion so far has touched upon urban-rural, and in the past couple of decades in this century, we have seen concepts like metrolingualism coming up. The point of departure being that something is happening because of migration in geographies that we call urban sites. And I think doing research in context, I haven't done research in any part of the continent of Africa, but in other spaces that are called the rest, including what we call the global north, that is Sweden. And a very recent study that we've sent in, Kavita Rane from Mumbai, and we have looked at urban-rural spaces in Asia with a lot of what you are calling naturalistic inquiry, data across different decades, and we are claiming that there isn't any difference. This is a very global north coinage. So metrolingualism is something we've invented, and we need to, so that discussion of the urban-rural I align to. But there are other kinds of concepts or naming practices, for instance, switching. So then we are reinforcing the idea that there is a language A and a language B, and then we switch, which is not what you actually are showing us. You're very eloquently kind of highlighting that there is something else going on. So here the comment would be from me that ELAN is something that reinforces this, because we need to put into ELAN some concepts that then very systematically goes through the data. So I gave up ELAN a number of years ago. I think it was version 13 or 14, and I don't know what version is in circulation right now. But my question to you is with regards to representation. I'm fully aware we can't do without calling something something. Mm-hmm. But do you see this slippage that we all get into when we call something? You talked about Tutsi Tal in Swedish spaces. I have a colleague who wrote his PhD 20 years ago, and he called what is called slang, immigrant slang outside of Sweden, he called that blatte, which is a concept that is wrong Swedish, but translating from the title of his thesis, blatte means friend, which is what young people, and of course boys, he was tracking them in school spaces. He found that blatte, and this is Richard Jonsson, if you're interested, he found that young boys have a counter-hegemonic discourse and ways of being, including their what they wear and where they hang out and what they do. That's part of what I heard you say. So do you see this kind of coinage or naming traditions that we as scholars slip into as part of how we ourselves continue to contribute to coloniality?
Yeah, I mean, of course, it's you know, as you said, we have to call something something at some point, but then, you know, you obviously constrained by the terms that you've got, you know, for things. And I mean, yeah, I looked at metrolingualism and I didn't think it suited, you know, the way it was constructed, in at least in Pennycook's early work. I didn't think it really suited the context here. So, and I looked at a few other terms that sort of didn't really fit, and also the idea of switching and, you know, yeah, these things. The idea is that, you know, there's a community of people here in Africa who are coming up with other ways to describe these things, and I think that's what I was trying to highlight, that there's so many people working on these practices and you know, generating new knowledge and hopefully new theories and new sort of methodological approaches as well. Yeah, I mean, there's a richness certainly in this field because it's emerging from these contexts. So, but yeah, I think it's very hard to get away from those naming practices. In terms of the naming of Tsotsitaal itself, it's always been a problem in the literature, because obviously Tsotsi is this sort of gangster figure. You know, people have critiqued the use of the word, and you know, some users reject it and other people continue to use it. So you know, I had a group in Durban in KwaZulu-Natal who called it Isitsotsi, and then, you know, it's got lots of different names, and then other people don't call it a name, they just say ringas, which means talking, and you know, so again, you know, trying to represent how speakers represent it is important. And I think, you know, that work has been done in different places. Heather Brooks discussed a nomenclature issue around the naming of youth practices in South Africa in quite some depth. I think, I can't remember which publication it was, but yeah, there's been some work looking at those issues as well. And yeah, it's an ongoing issue. You know, if we can come up with, or if researchers can come up with new ways to describe and think about these things, that would be great.
Thank you, Dr. Hurst. We have a comment in the chat box from Amy. She says, hello and thank you for this presentation. With Sheng, which is ever evolving, current generations do sometimes exclude older generations and authority figures to speak among themselves. However, there's also the idea of speaking to other or / older generations while at the same time excluding them. They address issues such as unemployment, sex, etc. So in a way, there are some aspects of these issues they want to share amongst themselves or with larger society. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, well, it makes me think, because you know, the idea of taboo and sort of avoidance, and sometimes these sort of youth practices are used to say things that wouldn't normally be sayable. So they've been used, yeah, to address things like taboo things such as sex, and you know, they've been used in sort of campaigns, like media campaigns as well, to enable people to talk about things that they wouldn't otherwise be able to talk about in their own languages. So it is really interesting, actually.
Okay, we have another question by Christine Severo. Thanks a lot for your inspiring presentation. In terms of youth language practices in decolonial contexts, do you consider the possibility of cross-border and comparative analysis that bring together language experiences concerning the performance / styling of youth identities? For example, is it possible to attend to similarities between how young indigenous people in Brazil and in South Africa index decolonial meanings in their practices?
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be really interesting work. And so, I mean, yeah, we've got that new book coming from, it's a kind of global perspective on youth language. We've tried to bring together some of the issues in the introduction. I mean, I've done cross-border work with a student here. He's now graduated with his PhD, but he looked at Zimbabwe youth language practices, and they were quite heavily influenced by some of the practices happening in Johannesburg, for example, which is sort of regionally a kind of style center, you know. So that was interesting. In terms of sort of looking at, yeah, Brazil to South Africa would be really interesting. I think, you know, particularly if you're moving into kind of pragmatic approaches, there'd be a lot of really, really interesting work to be done there. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, there's a comment from Vishna. Thank you so much for your insightful talk, Dr. Hurst. I would love to hear more about how body language might be used to index urban youth identity in Tsotsitaal. Would you happen to have any insights or perhaps hypotheses about this?
Yeah, I mean, so there's people like Heather Brooks again, who's worked on gesture and Tsotsitaal. So she kind of initially she sort of recorded gestures and then categorized them as, you know, isikanto, which was a word that she preferentially used for the Tsotsitaal data, I think, in that early publication, 2004. But since then, she's looked more at sort of a range of performance practices, which include gesture. I mean, they draw on a whole range of resources, including lexical and gestural, and yeah, body posture, body language. So, so her work could be particularly interesting. I mean, you know, gesture itself is often used in place of meaning, or, you know, there are many ways that gesture can be used in youth languages. So yeah, there's definitely been a few publications on that, which I could include in the bibliography when I write it.
Oh, thank you so much. Let me just see, Robin Subino, thank you for your presentation. Is there evidence of the practices you discuss in use among deaf people or emerging in written forms?
I haven't seen any work on the use among deaf people, but that would be really interesting, especially because of the, you know, the paralinguistic aspects of the practices. In written forms, yeah, there has been some sort of look. The thing is, they're not codified; they're not kind of standardized. So, in terms of the, you know, so I was talking about Facebook, and so there's this group called what's it called now? It's School of Tsotsitaal. And in that space, the participants were sharing like terms that they used in their neighborhood, in their hood, for a particular concept. And you know, there'd be like a concept like, I don't know, a particular shoe, and everybody had a different name for this particular kind of popular shoe. And so it was sort of, it showed a range of relexicalization across South Africa in that way. But obviously, you know, the spellings weren't like agreed upon, and you know, you see that in the data as well, and in transcriptions, like everybody has a different idea about how these things are written. And then yeah, there's been a little bit of work on how they've been sort of commodified in advertisements. I know in Kenya that's been looked at as well. So how youth language is used in like advertising to kind of attract the youth segment of the population. And then yeah, in newspapers to kind of yeah, and in cartoons as well. There was a newspaper in Kenya that had like cartoons using Sheng and so on. So there's a certain amount of work on that, yeah.
Okay, and there's no comments at the moment, so I'm just going to ask a question myself. So Tsotsitaal is represented as a youth language, but it seems to encode the lived experiences of men more than women. For instance, beer, just drinking of beer and the camaraderie that's around that. Things like, armed struggle, that was very funny, and violence as well. Is there research done on this idea of social and gender?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So that didn't come up in my talk at all, but it's obviously it's sort of a big issue. So Stephanie Rudwick's done some work on this. I think she's talking in the next session, and Heather Brooks again did some work with a student of hers on this. So there's some documentation of the use of like tzotzil by women to give them kind of status in male spaces, so like on the streets and so on, and then also use by women who identify as lesbian, and use it for particular identity performances as well, and then women who just hang out with men and use it. And then I had a student as well who looked at the shebeen queens, as he called them, and the ladies who run the shebeens and how they use it to negotiate status as well in those quite dangerous spaces sometimes, I think. So women use it definitely, like this sort of male style. And then of course, it's not like women aren't also using youth styles. They're just, differentiated from sort of tzotzil. So I've got a student who's doing quite a lot of work at the moment on social media. So she's looking at WhatsApp conversations and how women sort of use particular forms and draw on particular resources to create community within WhatsApp spaces, within social media spaces. So of course, women also use creative language and so on. And I think it's another area that needs more attention as well. Yeah, but thank you very much for the question.
No problem. Okay, so there's another comment. Okay, no, that is from Sangeeta to Robin. So just some references that Sangeeta is sharing. Thank you so much. Prof. Makoni, can I give it over to you? Do you have any more questions or comments? Or anyone else in the conversation today? You are muted, Prof.
Ashraf, what's your take on this? In the Arab world, how does this play itself out? Okay.
Thank you very much. Actually, I was thinking about this in the context of Arab world. Now we have, for example, in Sudan, we have a revolution which is going on against dictatorship, and it's led and organized mainly by youth, young people in the age of 20s, you can say. But those practices are not, and this is supposed simplest point, those revolutionary practices, they're serious practices because people actually demonstrate in the street and they get killed. Every week we get around 3 young revolutionaries killed by the security forces, and America is supporting that dictatorship. So those that struggle, which is organized by young people, and also they have their own linguistic practices, linguistic vocabulary. It's not for the youth; it's for the whole country. The practice actually is intended to reconstruct the whole space, the whole country. It's even intended for the old people, if I can use that that expression. So the idea of viewing them as isolated, as just representing themselves, this is the narrative of the colonial, I can say, and even agents of colonialism, which is represented by dictators mainly. Yeah, thank you. So I just need to see how you react, Ellen. And thank you for the presentation. I did enjoy it.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I did work with a few people on. So I had a colleague. Well, we're still in touch, and she's doing a book on kind of youth practices in Algeria. So we've looked at some of the Arabic contexts in Africa. And then there was another couple of people at one of our conferences who did a sort of survey of youth practices, and there have been a couple of publications on like Moroccan Moroccan youth language practices as well. So there's a bit of work coming out of those northern countries in Africa as well. I guess there are differences, and there are sort of, yeah, I don't know, but I mean, the practices are still emerging in those contexts, I think. But they're just, I guess they're defined differently because, yeah, I'm not sure. I'm actually just trying to think of the lady's name who's working on the Algerian context. She's had a couple of really interesting publications about the practices of youth in Algeria. But I'll try and get that as well for the bibliography.
Yeah, what you wanted?
Yes. Prof. Busi Makoni?
No, Busi wanted to talk, Simon. I'll contribute that later.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I have just two very mundane questions. The first one is there a relationship between Tsotsitaal and Fanagalo? And secondly, I've noticed that in most publications dealing with Tsotsitaal, the Tsotsi is referred to as uclever all the time. But there are also other terms that are in use to refer to uclever. For instance, okuluba, amagents. So my question is, why is there a preference for uclever?
Okay, I think with the first question, there's no relationship between Tsotsitaal and Fanagalo that I'm aware of. Yeah, I worked on Fanagalo, and obviously it was from the mining context, and it was a sort of created language which then took on a life of its own. Now it's used by like shopkeepers in Natal and so on. There's a lot of, in KwaZulu-Natal, there's people that using it between sort of shop workers and client and customers and so on. And that was described in a recent thesis. But yeah, it has no crossovers that I'm aware of with Tsotsitaal. It's a different kind of phenomenon. So that was, I mean, Raj Mesri describes it as a sort of classic pidgin, whereas Tsotsitaal can't be described as a pidgin. It's a, it's a Stylect in the way that I've described it today. And then with regards to the clever, so I mean, I wouldn't say that Tsotsi and clever are the same thing. The Tsotsi figure was this sort of iconic gangster kind of figure, whereas the clever it's more connected with being streetwise. And as you say, there are lots of other words for that, Najitas and Amagents and so on, which, it's a sort of example of over-lexicalization. There's a lot of words for streetwise guys in Tsotsitaal because that's the main users is these streetwise guys. So you've got like Lover, and I'm just trying to think of all the others. There's a whole host of names, and then also endearments between guys, like they call each other, Mfetu and Mjita, and so they've got all these endearments. So I think that's an area where there's definitely heavy relexicalization or over-lexicalization, because that's sort of the core of the identity of the speakers, So I don't know, the preference for clever, I think, it's used across the whole country. Everybody has kind of heard of it. But there's, as you say, there's a lot of other terms that are used as well.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Busi Makoni. Yes.
Yes.
Prof. Do you want to take over?
Yes, let me, I want to focus our minds on issues about meta language, but to some extent, that's what we are talking about. What we are discussing, I think, is whether there is something like the politics of meta language. And I think the easiest way for me to articulate this argument is for me to read to you a paragraph from Chris Hatton's chapter, which will appear in the book that Basiantia and myself are supposed to be handing over to Routledge as we speak. And he focuses on meta-language, politics of meta-language. And there's a category that he calls denaturalizing sociolinguistics. And I think our discussion fits into this. He says this, and I quote, "Sociolinguistics as a subdomain of linguistics drew its methodological confidence from the apparent stability of a set of authentic, romantic, or quasi-romantic labels and identity categories: community, class, Creole, culture, dialect, ethnicity, gender, identity, mother tongue, multilingualism, native speaker, vernacular, with the underlying disciplinary aim of liberating society from ideologies of deficit. However, these very categories have been challenged as harmful reifications, including the fundamental concepts of named languages. The organicist legacy of sociolinguistics is now being viewed with ambivalence. So although notions like native speaker, mother tongue, ethno-linguistics group have considerable ideological force, and as such should certainly feature as objects of analysis, they should have no place in the sociolinguistic toolkit itself. These concepts are in fact to be downgraded, removed from the set of labels used for comparing sociolinguistic conditions across different societies. For speech, now read multimodal discourse. For ecology, economy. For product, process. For linguistic change and diffusion, read circulation. For multilingualism, substitute superdiversity. Then he proceeds. Basically, what I think Chris Hatton is saying, which is relevant to our argument here, is that we need a thorough discussion about the nature of the meta-language that we are using. Because the relationship between the meta-language and what we are describing is very complicated. It's not simply that you are representing a particular speech variety or style, etc. In some cases, you are creating it through the analysis. Where our work differs from the, let's say, archaeologists, etc., they may have stones that they describe which have got an objective reality outside our analysis. But that is not the case at all in linguistic analysis. Whether you are using whatever technological instrument you are using, you are partially creating the object of analysis as you go along. That the object does not exist independently of us. We create it as we go along. That partly explains why students in undergraduate level are always confused with courses in linguistics, because what the sociolinguists are talking about in terms of language is totally different from what the psycholinguists are talking about, from what the applied linguists are talking about, because the analytical categories that they are using are very different, and they all create very different images of what it means to use language, or what a language user is, right? That's my main. That's one of my main concerns about this discussion. The other discussion, I think, which Elena began to talk about, is the sort of decolonial thrust to it. My feeling is that whatever way you're going to define decoloniality, it has different meanings in different contexts. And decoloniality in sociolinguistics is not so much like an add-on analysis. From the decoloniality should be evident from the selection of the concepts of what you are studying through the methodological analysis to how you are reporting what you are doing. So it's not like I'm doing a decolonial analysis as an afterthought. Decoloniality is an all or nothing affair. You either are doing it or you're not doing it. It's not like it's a partial exercise. Yeah. That's my only, that's my few comments. Right. No, it's interesting. It's interesting. It's interesting. It's interesting.
I don't know if I was doing I don't know if I was doing a decolonial analysis or if I was pointing out that that the speakers were engaging in decolonial practice.
Yeah, that's why, for example, in the discussions of decoloniality, why the former Soviet socialist republics and what they do and what they understand by decoloniality there is it's interesting to listen to, because what has tended to happen in discussions about decoloniality, they've tended to be driven by scholars in Latin America, Minolo, etc., and all that, and a couple of African scholars. But when you go to a completely different geographical region, for example, in the former Soviet socialist republics, there's a lot of work that they are producing on decoloniality. And you listen and read what they're talking about. It changes completely your understanding about what decolonial practices mean. In other words, we need a much more global understanding of decoloniality rather than a notion of decoloniality which is tied and restricted, or which has just emerged from the work of a couple of political scholars, Minolo and company and all that. Yeah. So for example, in volume 2 of our series, it's an interesting collection because for the first time you have Bonaventura dos Santos juxtaposed with Minolo, Catherine Walsh, Molife Asante, who talks about the Afrocentricity, all in one volume. And we're trying to navigate the points of intersection, the differences between all these individuals. We've done a lot of work, but you never find their work in one volume, so you never are able to make sense of what they're trying to work on. So for example, the interesting discussion in those particular volumes about decoloniality is the response by Bashir Suleiman, the Senegalese scholar, his response to Ngugi. It's more or less like a Francophone response to what Ngugi is saying. But that debate hardly comes up, hardly features a lot in Anglophone scholarship, because we don't, some of us don't read French, so we're not very familiar with his work. In other words, the point I'm basically making is that there's so much of this scholarship that is available that we need to read. Of course, we'll never have time to read all of it, but those are just my comments. I think, Chanel, you've heard me lament about this so many times that you're just saying, there he goes again.
Okay, Dr. Hurst, any final thoughts, perhaps?
I guess, I mean, it's not exactly in response to what Prof was just saying, but, you know, I think in terms of representation, we also need to listen to speakers, you know, and what they're saying about their practices and about their languages. And you know, I mean, people that I've interviewed over the last 15 years have certainly believed that they're doing something, and they've called it certain things, or they've described it in particular ways. And they also believe that they're challenging, you know, dominant structures through these practices. So I think there's definitely, you know, there's a need to also to acknowledge that they're doing these things quite consciously and in challenge to to coloniality, or to the systems that are kind of disadvantaging them a lot of the time. So,
I mean, for example, the research strand in linguistics in integrational linguistics, or the ones on folk linguistics, etc., where you are taking seriously the lay people's views and understanding about what they think they're doing. right, is if they think what they're talking about is language, so be it, it's language from their perspective. I think you're right that we need somehow to incorporate the lay people's own views and understandings about their own universes. Yeah, I completely agree.
Thank you. I will now call on Kim to announce the speaker for next week.
Yes, thank you. So as Dr. Hurst mentioned, next week, January 21st, Friday, we'll have Stephanie Rudwick talking about Southernizing the Study of English as a Lingua Franca, and that will be at 9 a.m. Eastern US time. So we hope you can join us next week as well. So thank you so much and have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Hurst.
Thank you
Thanks
very
so much for having me.
Thanks, Ellen.
Thanks everybody for your really great comments as well.